Good evening and a very happy Bi-Visibility Day to everybody tuning in to tonight's panel discussion. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Nimerta. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Families and Youth Officer for Northern Pride. I'm also the Regional Officer for an LGBT plus inclusion charity called Diversity Role Models, and I am bisexual. We're here today to celebrate Bi-Visibility Day. It's a day where we talk about bi history, the bi community. We celebrate the diverse identities that come under the bi plus umbrella. And we also are going to discuss today issues that involve biphobia, so prejudice that members of the bi community will face, Bierasure, so the dismissal or the lack of appreciation for bisexuality as an identity in its own right. So I'm really pleased to be joined today by four great panelists who are going to talk about these issues today. So I'll just introduce them one at a time, and if you can say a little bit about yourself before we jump into our panel discussion today. So if I start off with Eve.
Hi, I'm Eve, I'm 21 and I'm a third year sociology student at Newcastle University. I'm bisexual and I've been volunteering alongside Nimerta at Diversity Role Models for just over a year now. And my pronouns are she, her.
Thanks, Eve. And do we have Kaz? Hi, Kaz, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Nimerta. I'm Kaz. I'm a councillor based in the northeast of England. I last year was involved with putting on the world's biggest ever Bi Pride, which was an amazing day. I identify as both queer and bi, and I think there's just an awful lot to celebrate and talk about this evening. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic, I definitely agree. Have we got Matthew?
Yep, sorry, my mic was muted there. I'm Matthew, I'm 20, my pronouns are he, him, and I identify as bisexual and transgender. I'm a university student at the Northumbria University, and I'm studying geography and hope to be a teacher in the future.
Oh, excellent. I was a teacher in my previous profession, so it's good to hear. And last but not least, we've got Charlie as well. Charlie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Charlie. I'm 19 years old. I'm both bisexual and trans, and my pronouns are he, him.
Fabulous. It's lovely to have you all here today. I'd just like to start off talking a little bit about the diversity of identities that come under the bisexual umbrella term or bi plus term, and whatever that means to you. So any insights you have around what it means to be bi and the different identities within that. Shall we start off with Charlie?
Bisexuality to me is just, I don't really care what you identify as gender-wise. If you're a nice person, then I don't really mind what your gender is.
Wonderful. So you're attracted to the person, and gender doesn't come into that.
Yeah.
Shall we go to Eve?
I think when I was younger and I was first coming to terms with my sexuality, bisexuality was it felt like the right fit, because to me that just meant not straight, just not heterosexual. And now as I've become more aware of other gender identities and stuff, I'm the same as Charlie. I'm not too fussed, I'm not too bothered as long as they're a nice person. So I think I would technically be classed as pansexual. However, bisexual was the first one that I kind of knew about, and so that's what I like.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about bisexuality plus as being an umbrella term, and one identity that can often be fit under that umbrella is pansexuality. So the idea of being attracted to somebody regardless of gender or no gender, and I can kind of see that, you know, for some people, I think for me personally, actually, if I just get a bit candid, I identify as bisexual, but it took me a long time to actually come out and come to terms with that. And I'm the same as you. I sort of think to myself, well, actually, am I more, do I fit under a pansexual definition? But I'm not there yet to kind of, you know, change identities at the moment. I think it took me a lot of effort to say, yes, I'm bi. So that might take a bit more time for me to reconcile how I fit in that. Kaz?
I think there's something really interesting here, and it's loving hearing people talk, because there's bisexual, the identity, and then there's sort of the bi plus umbrella, and it kind of, it allows so much space for fluidity, because you can identify under the umbrella, which is just basically you're attracted to more than one gender, or you're bisexual is your identity. And I'm slightly older, I think, than most people in this room. We used to be so rigid, you know, so determined to put people into little boxes. And I think it's just incredibly positive to think we're moving away from the idea that you need to pick a label and pin it on yourself for life.
Oh, definitely. I think that some of the work that I do is in schools, and I'm engaging with kids at the moment with you know, the work I do with diversity role models, and it's amazing to see even with that generation. So you know, the next generation of adults, they'll kind of be maturing in the next 10 years or so, are already so much more open in their thinking about both sexuality, romantic attraction, as well as you know, gender identity as well, which can sometimes be conflated when we're talking about these topics. Matthew?
Very similar to what you've all already said. I mean, personally for me, my journey with it has been kind of bouncing between quite a few labels, but almost always coming back to bisexual, because that's the one that's kind of explained it the most in terms of my attraction. And it's just, it's been the one constant definition, if anything, that's kind of stayed true throughout it all. So yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder if anyone would like to sort of talk about their process of maybe coming to the terms themselves. I don't know if coming to terms is the right phrase that I mean, but realizing that you are bisexual, and maybe if anybody has ever gone through a process of wondering if you're either straight or gay, and then kind of coming to that conclusion once you realize it can't be that binary. Has anybody had that experience?
I know back when I was a teenager, around 14 or 15 or so, I just thought I was the world's worst lesbian, because I'd never come across the term bi. I knew there was gay people, I knew there was straight people. So I thought, because I was attracted to girls, and back then I hadn't even considered gender identity, I thought that meant I was gay. And that's why I think it's so important that we go into schools, because it was really upsetting for me, because I thought I can't even get being a lesbian right. So it was hugely important for me to discover that there were other ways of being, and that it didn't mean I was doing everything wrong.
Absolutely. And we're going to touch on sort of biphobia and sometimes the stereotyping that can come with sort of labeling yourself as bi. So if that's your identity, the kind of attitudes that people might have around that. Has anybody sort of maybe been affected by other people's attitudes towards bisexuality in terms of maybe hindering their journey towards finding out what their identity is?
Kind of, yeah. There was a stereotype that my mum actually believed was that bisexual people were more likely to get like STIs. So when she explained to me that stereotype, me already knowing I was bisexual, I was kind of a bit iffy to then tell her. But I realized, you know, she's my mum. She can't not love me for who I am, essentially. So I told her a while after I'd figured it out, and she was okay with it. The only thing she said was, "I just wish you would have been gay."
And how did that impact you at all to hear her say, "Oh, I wish you'd just been gay"?
A bit. It was a bit upsetting to hear, but I realised that my identity is not going to change as of the moment. So, in a sort of selfish sense, she's going to have to learn to deal with it. If that makes sense.
That's great, and it's really good that you had have that confidence in yourself and your identity to sort of to know that and to feel that. Just sticking around the idea of bisexuality as an identity and also as an umbrella term as well. Just interested because of the panel being a mix of people who identify as women and men and non-binary potentially as well. How does the panel feel that gender maybe affects an individual's ability to feel comfortable coming out as bi?
I feel like, especially for women, bisexual women are over-sexualized, and it's usually for like the male gaze and for the benefit of men. So, for example, I went on a date with a girl in my first year of university, and I felt quite like I couldn't show affection just because I knew how it might be like perceived by other people. So it kind of holds you back a bit. And then I don't want to speak for Charlie or Matthew, but bisexual men can often be just told that they're lying and that they're actually just gay, and they're just kind of dismissed as well. So it's two different ends of like hyped up completely and over sexualized, or you just dismissed and you don't exist at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that brings us in really nicely to sort of talking about, you know, biphobia and bi-erasure as well as two areas that are a really important part of this conversation today, because it's something that can stop people coming out as bi and something that can really, really impact an individual's life and well-being and health therefore as well. So want to just give a little bit of time for everybody to talk about their experiences with both biphobia and bi-erasure. Matthew, can we start with you?
With biphobia, it's kind of, for me, it's never gone much further than just being told, like the normal kind of, well, I wouldn't say normal, but the sort of thing that a lot of bisexual people hear is being told that you're greedy or you need to just pick one, or kind of like, you know, you're more likely to cheat and stuff like that. And it's often quite insulting to hear that, especially when you get told it over and over again. But there's quite often the stereotypes that you kind of have to put up with. They can kind of, for me, they started to make me doubt my identity a little bit, in the sense that I was kind of questioning, like, well, am I more likely to cheat, or am I going to have to pick a side eventually? And it was hard, but it's, yeah, that's kind of pretty much it, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I can totally relate to that personally. From my experience, I started to sort of explore the idea of being bi when I was an older teenager. So I was about just a little bit younger than Matthew and Charlie. I was about sort of 17, 18. And I think I remember at the time with my social circle, although I could openly tell them that's, you know, I was questioning my sexual identity and that I thought I might be bi. I think I remember actually a lot of it turning into teasing and sort of jokes and stuff that maybe at the time for my younger self, I didn't necessarily know it was biphobia. I thought it was banter, and you know, some of the jokes were actually quite horrible now that I think back to it. But it was definitely a lot of stuff that impacted me emotionally. And then I hate to say it, and I think we all know that coming out isn't necessarily a singular process. It's something that you do throughout your life if you are LGBT plus. But I think it caused me to maybe go back in the closet a little bit at uni. So I definitely echo, you know, the impact of that dismissal of who you are, or that assumptions and stereotypes of your own, you know, desires and wants and stuff. Kaz, what experiences of biphobia and bi-erasure have you had?
Well, I was just thinking about what you said then, how the two of them are linked, because we do internally, we get these messages about, you know, especially, I think, you know, aside from people at birth, people get this hypersexualization and, you know, this idea that being bi is some sort of performative thing you do for men. And because we don't see enough conversations about bi people, and we don't hear, about bi experiences, it's really easy to question and go, well, am I really bi? And, is this how I want to be? And you almost get in this vicious circle. So as we tackle the bi erasure, we can also tackle the internalized biphobia.
That's a really, really important point. I really get what you mean about that internalized biphobia, that actually, because although the biphobia is happening, I think it's quite often happening in a very casual way. Casual doesn't mean the impact is any less, but it's certainly not addressed. It's certainly not talked about enough. Even in, dare I say it, even in LGBT plus forums themselves, I don't think biphobia is talked about enough. So if you can't outwardly express how that's hurting you, you tend to inwardly, I can imagine that people would attack themselves inwardly, and that cause a lot of mental health, issues for individuals. I think as a counsellor, I'm sure you can relate to how that would impact somebody in terms of their mental health. Sorry, Kaz, go ahead.
Sorry, it's just such a really good point about mental health, because if people don't feel able to come out because they're worried about the biphobia, then they can't get the support that they need, and they end up in a worse position without being able to reach out. And sometimes that includes, sadly, LGBT groups where, people will have heard remarks, and so they can't go and get the support that they need.
Yeah, absolutely. We were having, I think we were having a conversation just before we went live, actually, about some of the spaces. Perhaps it might be in terms of sexual health or mental health, but spaces that are sort of designed towards the LGBT plus community sometimes forget the B part and actually aren't necessarily as helpful to people that are bisexual, because there's this sort of tendency to lean towards supporting people that are in same-sex, relationships. Eve, I want to come to you with this topic of biphobia and bi-erasure.
I would say, like Kaz was saying, it doesn't have to be out and in your face and violent and visceral, like you don't exist. Like a lot of it is quite subliminal, and for that reason it goes unchallenged quite a lot because you don't actually realize it's there. So for example, like as Matthew said, like I've been called greedy and confused, like that's like friends, family, colleagues, and for the most part it is a joke. And you do take it as a joke for the most part. However, it feels a lot different when it comes from a straight person rather than other queer people. Because I think it was Namerta, you said earlier, like it's banter, but they don't realise the negative effect that it has. So like now that I'm older and more comfortable in like who I am, like you realise how damaging stereotypes are and like how far in they contribute to, say, like negative mental health. And yeah, I won't come out as bisexual if I'm in like a new surrounding until I know that I'm comfortable and I'm safe. And as you said, it's a constant coming out. I had to re-come out when I came to university, having already done that with my friends at home. And it's just constantly, you want a balance between, I shouldn't have to come out, as simple as that, and also you don't want to be seen as something that you're not. So, and it's balancing that back and forth, and it's quite exhausting, to be fair, constantly having to think about it.
Absolutely. I actually have a recent anecdote. Apologies if this person is watching. I mean this with the greatest love, but I had an interaction with a spouse of a friend who didn't realise I was bi, and that they are actually bi themselves, and we've known each other. I mean, they've been married to a really good friend of mine for years, and because the conversation had never happened, and I'm actually in quite a straight passing relationship. I'm in a relationship with a man, and I have been for 7 years. it just seemed to have just gone, you know, not been a conversation that we'd had, and they suddenly, you know, we realised that I was, you know, I work for a queer charity, and they put two and two together, and yeah, it was just quite a funny moment where, you know, another bi person had actually just assumed I was straight. So yeah, it's interesting. Charlie, have you got any other sort of experiences? I know you touched a little bit on it earlier, but any other experiences of biphobia and bi-erasure?
The only one I really had was I came out in school, and once the other kids found out, they always assumed I was in a relationship with someone. Like, the first question I'd get would be, "Who with?" Like, it's kind of like sexualized, I guess, thing in that a bisexual person is always in a relationship with another, which obviously isn't true. And also, in school, one of my teachers sent me to talk to another student who identified as lesbian, and she assumed that I would just end up being a lesbian like her, because she said that she identified as bisexual first, and then came to realize she was a lesbian, which wasn't the case with me, because I still identify as bisexual. So even within the LGBT community, it can just be assumed that eventually you're going to pick a side.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point, to sort of talk about the idea of yeah, and even within the LGBT plus community and outside of it, that there is this often misconception that it's either a phase or a process of moving towards being gay or lesbian, which it isn't. You know, that's bi-erasure in itself, isn't it? It's erasing bisexuality as a legitimate identity in itself. And I really, you know, I really understand what you're saying about quite often the bisexual identity tends to be defined about who you're in a relationship with. And I say that again as somebody in quite a straight passing relationship. I'm not straight. I am definitely bisexual, and that's an identity that I'm very clear on. But I've been with a guy for 7 years, and I think quite often that it can lead people to sort of turn around and question whether I am actually bi. And I just feel like, why is it about who I'm with? Why can't it be about who I am as an individual?
That's the thing with like bi visibility, because you're assumed to be straight. If you were with a woman, you would be a lesbian. So like at least lesbians or gays like kind of are afforded that visibility, but we aren't, because you can't see. So
yeah, I 100% agree with that. Oftentimes, every year, kind of around Pride Month, and when it starts to get to when Pride festivals would be around, there's almost always these posts circulating online where it's like talking about straight couples at Pride and straight people at Pride. And quite often, I do see a lot of aversion from the LGBT community where they don't want straight people at Pride. And quite often the mistake that a lot of the LGBT community tend to make, or rather like the LG community would make, would be that they assume that a straight couple is a straight couple, when oftentimes they might be just a straight passing couple. So there tends to be quite a lot of people who kind of overlook a straight passing couple and just think that they're straight, because, you know, they don't look into the fact that one of them could be bi and that's why they're there, or, I mean, entirely overlooking the fact that they might be supportive. But another kind of massive part of bi-erasure tends to be when you come out as bisexual. A lot of people go, well, it's not that big of a deal. They kind of dismiss how big of a deal it might be for someone.
I think that's a really good point, Matthew. Something I've noticed, almost this idea that bis have privilege over gay and lesbian people. That it well, you know, why are you coming out as bi? Whereas, you know, I don't want to hammer loads of stats, but all of the stats are worse, well, for cis bi people than for cis gay and lesbian people. That's a mental health, drug use, domestic violence, rape, sexual assault. It's actually much more difficult for bi people, yet really oddly, the assumption is, oh, well, you know, it's not a very meaningful thing to come out as.
Yeah, that's what I've heard quite a few times. And I mean, myself, I'm guilty of thinking, well, why has someone made such a big deal of coming out as bisexual? And then when it actually came to myself coming out as bisexual, I realized, oh, that's why it's such a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are, there are barriers that are not spoken about enough, particularly the concept of coming out in the workplace. I know that fewer people who, this is from some Stonewall statistics, actually, fewer, I think it's 1 in 5 individuals based on some current statistics, 1 in 5 individuals who identify as bi are happy to be out at work. And that's in comparison to 1 in 3 either gay or lesbian individuals. So it is slightly more challenging to come out at work. Any comments on that? Why might it be so much more difficult in the workplace for somebody that is bi?
Probably going down the whole thing again about if you're with, so say a bisexual man was with another man, quite often the assumption would be that he's just gay, and the same with if he was then with a woman, he would be seen as straight. So it's the constant flipping between being seen as one or the other, and rather than straight up as bi, like he identifies. So I mean, in my own workplace, there's a lot of constant joking and constant playful teasing between each other, kind of as banter. And a colleague of mine quite often has also experienced well, I thought you were a lesbian, when they've been in another relationship and then have gotten with someone of the opposite gender. And it's workplace banter can be often quite influenced by someone's sexuality. So that's where I think it might be hard in a workplace.
I think as well, we mentioned the stereotypes earlier. The stereotypes by people are so negative. The idea that we're deceptive, we're promiscuous, we spread disease, that it actually takes a lot of guts to come out to people in a workplace knowing that those are the thoughts that your work colleagues might be having about you. And so I can kind of see why a lot of people think, no, I don't want to face that at work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the from my experience, the sort of the hypersexualization of bi individuals is definitely part of the reason why I struggled. I mentioned earlier I was a teacher for about a decade, and I was never publicly out as a teacher. It's something that the whole, in terms of teaching, I think a lot of LGBT plus teachers would find it uncomfortable. It's getting better. But I think particularly as a bi individual, I don't think I can recall anybody else that I worked with either, or that I knew from the profession who was comfortable coming out at school, particularly because of that connotation of being promiscuous and being hypersexualized.
I think also you have to kind of prove yourself, to prove that you're bisexual. So if you've only been with men, then someone will say, well, how do you know that you like women? And if you haven't been with one, and it's kind of like, you shouldn't have to prove yourself, but you feel like you should. And it's just a bit of a back and forth conflict.
Absolutely. I'm just looking at some of the questions now that are coming in through the comments. Thank you very much, everybody that's been commenting. I'm just going to pick a few to pose to the panel here. We've got an interesting one here. Would you say that, given the progress that we're making with gender and sexual identities, that bisexual is perhaps behind the times by implying only there are 2 genders to be attracted to? So it's sort of bringing back our initial conversations about the bisexuality umbrella, and some identities that can be seen under that umbrella, and some of them, or some individuals who might see that as actually an identity in its own right. What are your thoughts on the bi part of bisexual? Do you think it's too binary?
No, because language evolves and changes. I mean, when the term was first developed, say like when Freud was using it, he thought there were only 2 genders, but we don't believe that anymore. We use the term bisexual to generally the most accepted definition is the capacity to be attracted to more than one gender. So yeah, I mean, kind of like bilingual doesn't mean there are only 2 languages. Bisexual doesn't mean there are only 2 genders.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight there in terms of the root of the term bisexual. I kind of, for me personally, as I said earlier, I was sort of grappling with the idea of whether I might identify as pan, because I see it as the individual. I mean, as I said earlier, I'm in a relationship with a man. If my partner tomorrow came out as non-binary, for example, I don't generally feel that I would love them any less. But at the same time, I've always defined bisexuality as being attracted or having the capacity to be attracted to any gender, not just a binary gender. So I think there's a big grey area there that sort of needs discussion. But let's not forget that each person needs to, have the right, or has the right to identify as what they see themselves to be, whether that's bisexual, whether that's pansexual in an identity in its own right and not underneath a bisexuality umbrella, or whether it is underneath the umbrella as well. It's that individual's right to be who they know they are. Okay. So I wanted to move on a little bit. We've got some more questions which we can come back to from the comments, but I just wanted to move on a little bit to talk about your thoughts around allyship. So how can either individuals or organisations be better allies to the bi community? What would you like to see, and what advice can you give? So if we could start with maybe Charlie.
I think maybe in terms of being a better ally, say if somebody is portraying like biphobic behaviour, maybe like call them out and try to better educate them on bisexuality and all that sort of thing, so they can maybe get a better understanding that not all the stereotypes are true, and it's just a stereotype.
Brilliant. Yeah. So maybe having the confidence that more people around you are going to be able to call out some of this stuff that we kind of might dismiss as banter, but actually has a huge impact. Eve, what are your thoughts around this?
On an individual level, I would say to not just tolerate bisexual people, but actively like celebrate, respect them. So this could be like being inclusive in your wording. So one of my friends is straight and she has a boyfriend, and that's fine, and I don't have a partner, but I say partner and so do my friends. And it doesn't seem like a big thing, and it isn't a big thing to do, but it makes the world of difference. And I think in terms of Bierasure and like a lack of representation of bisexual people, when it comes to television shows or films, like having characters who are bisexual, you shouldn't see it as tokenistic or as like political correctness, because it'll help people who are bisexual just in the same way that Black Panther helped so many young Black kids to see a Marvel superhero that looked like them. It's the same thing to have that representation. And I think a lot of people who have always been represented, say white, straight people, don't realise how important representation is, because their identity has always been validated.
Absolutely. And actually, I'll just come in a little bit with the idea of intersectionality. I'm Asian. I'm from an Indian heritage, and I really struggled a lot with coming out, because there were issues, in terms of being bi and being Asian, both from discrimination from my family and the Asian community, but also the impact of not having that representation of both being bi and being somebody from an ethnic background other than white, within the LGBT plus community. So yeah, I really echo that. I think representation is so important, and there isn't enough bi representation in the media. I think it's maybe getting better. I've done a lot of binge watching over lockdown, I must say. So I think I've seen a few shows recently where representation is improving, but there's definitely a lot more room there.
Yeah.
Can we hear from Kaz?
I think I mean, brilliant points made so far. And to take that representation one a bit further, a change we have to see on an organisational level is that it can very much sometimes feel that organisations are only interested in bi people when they're in same-sex relationships. So you think about sexual health services, they have, and this is a huge bugbear of mine, they have sexual health services for gay men and bi men, and then there'll be like services for lesbians and bi women, which makes absolutely no sense. But it sends the message that bi people are of interest to LGBT organisations if we're in a relationship that looks like a gay or a lesbian one. And we're kind of, oh, well, you're no longer part of the community if you're in a relationship that doesn't look like one of those. I don't like to say in a straight relationship, because if we're bi, we're never in a straight relationship. We need bi people to be represented as we are, and to have services that look at our needs, not, oh, well, we think you're all the same gender and you matter to us because you're in this type of relationship. And quite often as well, we see very specific issues for bi people get captured when LGBT orgs talk about things like suicide or mental health or domestic violence. So, and I'm a bit of a stats geek. Every year you'll see an LGBT org tweet, you know, the domestic violence rate for LGBT people is X, except that X is usually the rate for bi people. And it feels like those statistics are being used rather than centering on the bi community. So we need to see a lot more representation of bi people just as bi people, not lumped together with gay and lesbian.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from with that, and I suppose it maybe relates back to the lack of seeing bisexuality as an individual identity, and how it's sort of, you know, it's being lumped in with maybe who you're in a relationship with, what it looks like to other people, rather than it being about the individual or the people with the individual people within that community. Matthew, what are your thoughts around how organizations or individuals can be more bi inclusive?
Pretty much all the points I was going to make have already kind of been made. Definitely agreeing with Charlie in terms of, like, on the individual level, kind of not tolerating the biphobia and challenging anyone who is, displaying biphobic behavior. And I think when someone comes out as bisexual to you, I think, it's obviously okay to have questions and, want to know more about the person who's just come out to you and their identity if they're comfortable answering those questions. But I think generally, like, as an ally, you should kind of always keep an open mind and definitely challenge internal biphobic behaviors. So agreeing with stereotypes would be something that would be an internalized biphobic behavior, and or immediately making a comment about someone's, like, identity as bisexual when they come out to you, kind of holding back from making those comments, even if they're meant in a joking kind of way, because if someone's trusted you with that information, obviously it's very important to them.
Absolutely, yeah. I was just sort of thinking along those lines. How would the panel maybe advise individuals who are straight or indeed the LG, part of LGBT plus, who want to maybe ask more questions but are frightened perhaps to offend? I can imagine that being a barrier to maybe having more open conversations. What would you say to people that want to probe a little bit more but don't necessarily know how?
I think you can kind of tell when someone is trying to offend you and trying to be horrible. So if you just ask them if everything's okay, if it's like a neutral setting type thing, and you just say, hey, like I want to have this conversation, can we talk about X, Y, and Z? Obviously their experiences as bisexual isn't going to be universal, just in the same way that no straight people don't have the same experiences. It's the same for bisexuals. However, I think it's really useful to like hear it from the horse's mouth, because then it's not diluted. And I think they'll be quite thankful that you want to know more about them and understand them more as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really highlights just the fact that someone's asked highlights that they're not just assuming as well, not just either assuming straightness or you know, something else. I think it might be good to have a question from the comments section. So a question from the audience. So we've got a question here. So bi youth are less likely to be aware of safe spaces for LGBT plus individuals. And that's come from data from a particular human rights campaign. How do we think that we can reach more bisexual plus young people?
At the risk of repeating myself, by specific spaces, you know, especially because, you know, when you're younger, you may have heard these negative things in school and these assumptions. So bi-specific or multisexual or bi plus, you know, the sort of how we badge them in a sense is a different question, but making the spaces where it's like, okay, you think you're attracted to more than one gender, you're not quite sure what that means, the door's open and you're welcome.
Yeah, right. From my experience as an educator, and also with the work that I do now with diversity role models, spoken to a lot of young people, and I think what I hear is that they want the freedom to be able to sort of internally explore who they are. So maybe to be able to open that door and say I could be bi, but also to have that door remain open if they want to sort of go through that journey. There's one particular school I've worked with. I won't mention the school just now because I don't have their permission, but there's a school I've worked with who have quite a well-established LGBT plus society. It's not a bi-specific space, but when I visited them, there were a number of these are secondary school children. There's a number of those children that did at that moment identify as bi, but the teacher had explained to me that actually through their conversations they'd gone through a number of different, you know, identities in the years that they'd been at secondary school and been going to that society. So I really like what you said there about sort of having that space, but then saying the door is open for you to sort of figure out who you are in a safe way. Brilliant. Any other insights into how we could engage more young people that are questioning whether they're bisexual or identify as bisexual?
I think outreach into schools and colleges would be helpful. So obviously, I mean, I know your organisation, you work with schools already, but having like for things like Bi Visibility Day, having specific like workshops or chances to go in and talk to schools on those specific days and focus like the discussions around that. I think especially in school when a lot of the kind of banter and jokes that would be made are made by school age people around saying, oh, you're greedy, you know, things like that. That's a very common joke that would be made by teenagers. And I think going in to schools and addressing like the implications of making those jokes, while they might be intended as jokes, obviously some people might not take it that way. So kind of outreach in schools and awareness kind of programs and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this is something that diversity role models do, but it's something I think that Northern Pride have been sort of working with schools over the past year. It's sort of it's a campaign known as Pride in Schools, and it's something that we do want to try and continue. Obviously, with COVID at the moment, that's posing a major barrier, but hopefully, you know, using online platforms can be a way in there and continue that. You're absolutely right that the more that outreach can happen, the better, and the more people that can be role models and go in and talk to young people, the better as well. Can we have another question, perhaps? This is a lovely question. So I'm going to start with answering this one. The question is, what makes you proud to be bi? So from my own personal perspective, and again, like I said earlier, it took me quite a while to come to terms with my bisexuality. But now that I have, I'm proud that I can love anyone. That sort of, it sounds a bit cheesy, but I'm proud that I have the capacity to really appreciate an individual. For me, it's more of a romantic identity. I think I'm more drawn to who a person is than the sort of physicality. So for me, it's definitely a romantic attraction. But I'm proud of that. I'm proud that I can feel romantic to individuals regardless of their gender. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with not being able to, but it's something that I quite like about myself. And opening it up to the panel there, what makes you proud to be bi?
When I volunteer with diversity role models and with Nama, I have a little speech that I do because I go in as like a special guest and I talk to the students. And I think it's like the first paragraph I say I am a proud bisexual woman, because for a long time I was made to feel like I shouldn't be proud because I was different to what like everyone else seemed to be. And just being able to like even do this right now and be on a panel is like quite incredible. And if I was 12 knowing I was going to do this, it would be quite bizarre. But yeah, just to be able to just be open about who I am and kind of not have to hide it anymore. It's very freeing, and I would suggest it for everyone.
Fantastic, thank you, Eve. Anyone else want to talk about why they're proud to be bi, or what makes them proud to be bi?
Definitely agreeing with what Eve was saying about how kind of for a long time being pushed often to one side or another, and feeling the pressure to be one or the other, to be able to come out on the other side of that and say, well, yeah, this is definitely who I am. That's something that I feel very proud of. And I think as well, the process and like the journey I've been through with my identity, you know, it's taught me a lot, and I'm proud that I've kind of come out on the other end, in a better way of saying it, with like more tolerance and a lot more understanding for other people as well, that I didn't have when I was like 13 and 14 and first coming out.
Yeah, I kind of echoing something that Kaz said at the start of tonight's discussion. I kind of you've drawn my mind to the idea that sort of the bisexuality plus umbrella kind of brings this notion of fluidity and openness and acceptance of everybody, anybody, and I really like that sentiment.
I think
Charlie.
that's.
Oh, sorry, Kaz, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's what I'm proud of. The diversity of the bi community is just quite incredible, and it's something to be incredibly proud of.
Absolutely. Charlie, what are you proud of?
I'm proud that I just get to fully be myself. I don't have to pretend to be something I'm not. I can just be out as who I am, and through that I've made a lot of friends. And I feel a lot safer in who I am, knowing that I have friends that identify the same as me, and I can always go to if there's any trouble.
Absolutely brilliant. And I kind of just sort of mindful of the time as we're getting close to 8 o'clock that we just need to draw the conversation to a close. Something that just cropped up in my mind there, just as Northern Pride as a charity, how many of you have been to Pride celebrations, whether it's the Pride Festival in the summer or any other events?
I haven't.
Okay,
I'm not that bisexual.
No such thing.
I'm the road.
I'm just wondering if this, I'm going off piste a little bit here, but it's a question that popped into my mind there a little bit. What can Northern Pride do to improve bi inclusivity in the events that we run and the campaigns that we run?
I gotta say, and I'm not just saying this, because it's a Northern Pride thing. I think other prides can learn from Northern Pride. There's just such a genuine desire to do that by representation, to not just lump, the B in with the L and G and think you've got it covered. But I think it's about carrying that on, about not dropping the ball, so to speak, and carrying on with the raising up by people and saying, you are as important to us as monosexual people.
Yeah, I wonder. Obviously, we are celebrating today, and I think it's a great thing to have Bi Visibility Day. I think it's an important day to celebrate, but also that awareness that it's maybe something that needs to. Well, we're proud to be bi, 365 days of the year. So how can we include that into the rest of the year? We've got this is a comment or a question I've got down here. It's like a little comment. I've been to Newcastle Pride with a bi flag for a few years now and always been welcome to be bi. That's lovely to hear. I don't know if anyone can tell from my accent, but I'm actually from London originally, and I've only lived. He's laughing because I always bring this up as if it's a dirty thing. But I am Southern, for my shame. But I was blown away. My first Northern Pride up here, I was absolutely blown away with how welcome I was, not only as a bisexual, but actually as a Southerner, as somebody who's
a Southerner.
Yeah.
It would be the other way around if you were down south, and down south like, Northerner.
I hate to say it, but possibly. No, we're not going to diss the South. The South do a great job as well. But yeah, I hear what you're saying about maybe Northern Pride being a model that other prides could perhaps learn something from. And hopefully we'll have more conversations like this. I've got one last question, which I do want to squeeze in. It's a pretty good question here on schools. How do we encourage primary schools to welcome role models into schools, and for them to not succumb to the pressure to maybe shun away from LGBT plus inclusion, particularly when there are parents there that might discriminate against members of the community?
I think it's kind of realizing that, particularly with primary school, something that I've long argued whenever I've seen on the news about people opposing LGBT inclusive education within schools, it's realizing that we're not exactly going to go storming in there with something that's not age appropriate. Like in the same way that with straight relationship education, they don't go and tell 3-year-olds and nursery age young primary school age students about sex education. That's left more for secondary school. And I think it's kind of, people seem to forget and kind of ignore the fact that we're not going to go storming in there with NSFW content for 10-year-olds. It's definitely making sure that the parents are aware that it's going to be kept age appropriate. And I think that might often be the concern that a lot of parents might have. And I'm not saying that it's okay for them to be having the discrimination. It is often a concern. It's something that stems from concern that we're not going to be age appropriate when we talk about these things.
I think as well, when they assume it's not going to be age appropriate because of how over sexualized bisexual identities are. So, and if you don't have the education in schools, the kids are still going to be bisexual, kids are still going to be lesbian and gay. They're just going to find out this information in different avenues, and they might be more harmful than learning about it in an age appropriate environment in school. They might go on the internet and find materials that aren't suitable, and then that's how they learn. So really, I think it's quite irresponsible to not want your child to learn more about that sort of thing, because it's like however many people are bisexual or lesbian or gay or queer, that we represent such a big part of society, to then not be included in a curriculum is quite baffling to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just bring in a little anecdote from some of the work I do. not only do I run workshops for the children at school, but I run them for the parents and for teachers. You know, I've heard from some of my colleagues that have run parent workshops that, you know, they've had parents really questioning what we're going to be teaching their children. But by the end of that session, once they've had all their questions answered and they've realized that it's actually about teaching tolerance, not tolerance, beyond tolerance, even teaching, you know, acceptance of the diversity of individuals, and actually a bit of a you know, a celebration of all that diversity, that the parents really do come around. I think there needs to be more positive conversation around this. I've got an anecdote about a parent who was terrified really that we were going to question all the children in the class on what their sexual identity was. And I for a moment, for a split second, I really had to just stop myself, because I couldn't believe that parent thought that was what I was going to do, that as a professional, as a qualified teacher, I would put a child on the spot and question what their identity was in front of a class of people. But these are the concerns that parents do have. And I think, yeah, having conversations and getting it all out into the open, being honest about what really does happen in these lessons is very important. Any other comments and insights on that? No? Okay, so I think what I will do is draw the conversation today to a close, unless there are any other interesting questions. Just got Steve, the director of Northern Pride, in the background looking at comments and questions. Okay. Is that a comment there? I've dated more men than women, probably because the women I've dated thought I'd leave them for a man, which is hurtful. Yeah, I can kind of understand that even, you know, within the community, there being this sort of fear, like we've spoken about before, that this fear that bisexual individuals are more likely to be promiscuous. We mentioned that before, more likely to want multiple sexual partners, or to leave or cheat, and all of these negative terms and connotations. So just bringing this to a close, we've had a brilliant panel discussion today. And thank you very much to Eve and Kaz and Charlie and Matthew for bringing your experiences. I think, as we've said already, that element of being a role model, being somebody that goes out there and talks about your lived experience, is part of this you know, in this increase of bi-visibility that we need. So the more we can do this, the better. The bisexual community is obviously incredibly diverse, and there are going to be individuals that aren't represented by the wonderful faces that we have here today. And so something that Northern Pride would really like to do is to have more people involved from any you know, category under LGBTQI+. But, you know, in terms of increasing bi-visibility, if there are any individuals that want to get involved, do contact us via our social media handles. You can also get involved through our online magazine called Insight. I believe there's a link just down there below. So our Insight magazine is a way for individuals to have their voices heard. So you can write an article, write a piece. It could be, you know, any sort of written piece really that we can publish on there. It might be by week, but we will publish into, you know, pieces from individuals who are bi, who identify as bi, beyond this week as well. So just, you know, do submit whatever you'd like, and do contact us if you want to get more involved, if you've got ideas for events or discussions, etc., that you'd like to see. And thank you very much. So thanks again to our panelists, and thank you very much for everybody that's joined in today, and for all the excellent questions and comments in the comments box.